Hi everyone, so today we're going to be taking a look at all things fertilizer. There's a lot of mystery and a lot of misunderstanding around fertilizer, and it can be a little bit complex, as with anything in kind of the plant world. We're not going to dive too deeply into the science or chemistry behind any things, but I'm rather going to be touching on some general basics and some knowledge that you should have prior to buying a house plant and fertilizing it. And you know, it's okay if we're making mistakes, and if you're already doing this and not really understanding why you're doing it or what's best, that's totally okay. So let's dive right into this. There are time codes at the bottom of the video in the description if you guys would like to kind of sort through this video, because it's going to be a longer one, kind of in depth, and we have a lot of ground to cover as well. So you might be asking yourself, well, why do I need to fertilize my plant? And that's a good question. As the plant grows, it's going to require nutrients, and those nutrients have to come from somewhere. Over a period of time, nutrients are going to leach out of the soil through watering and draining, as well as just be used up by the plant as well. And that's where we come in with our fertilizer to replenish these nutrients to allow optimum growth, whether it be foliage growth, flower blooming, fruiting, or root growth. So fertilizer can be various different things, but primarily whenever you purchase a fertilizer, you're going to be seeing three numbers on the front of a container. And those are ratios. They can be in a general all-purpose as shown here, which is a 20-20-20 from Jack's. You can also find 10-10-10. Or various things such as like a 6-12-10, or tons of different ratios in between. And each of these numbers respectively stands for nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, or NPK. So for example, this Jack's fertilizer has a 20-20-20 balanced ratio of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Phosphorus, nitrogen, and potassium are going to be called macronutrients, meaning that they are used most readily by the plant. However, it's going to have various micronutrients as well. This can include zinc, magnesium, calcium, so on and so forth, that are all going to be crucial for your plant. And more often than not, you're not going to have to worry about those unless you're really fine-tuning and troubleshooting a very specific problem with a specific plant where you might have a calcium deficiency or something like that. So just a little synopsis here of each NPK and why they're used. So N, nitrogen, is used for foliage growth, and it also promotes new growth. So whenever you have a very foliage-rich plant, such as a philodendron, or a pothos, or a monstera, a spider plant, something like that, you're probably going to want to veer on the side of more nitrogen. So phosphorus also aids in tissue growth in the plant. It is also more readily used for root growth, as well as flower buds or fruit. More often than not, you're going to see phosphorus marketed for root growth. And last but not least in that ratio of NPK is potassium. Potassium has a lot to do with water retention in the plant, as it activates the stoma in the leaf, which is basically like a little vent for water to leave the plant. So now that we've kind of briefly discussed NPK and what each of those does respectively, let's talk about different types of fertilizers that you may find. So what is shown here is an artificial fertilizer that is used in water as a liquid. These are definitely an option. You can find these as like a Miracle Grow and things like that you just mix into water and pour directly onto the soil. Whenever you're using a liquid fertilizer, especially a synthetic one, it's important to be pretty cautious. You don't want to over-fertilize your plant. I actually dilute it to half of the recommended amount, which is important to note, and we'll kind of touch on this a little bit later in the video whenever we talk about when to fertilize. You can also find natural liquid fertilizers. So if you're more of a purist and you don't want to mess with any kind of artificial like blue liquid or anything like that, you can use various things such as fish emulsion, seaweed extract, kelp extract, so on and so forth. Also, whenever you're using a natural liquid, if you have a plant like an air plant or something, you can do what is known as foliar feeding, which is where you spray the plant and it actually uptakes nutrients through the leaves. And this can sometimes be more efficient for a plant, and it will actually be more of like a streamlined way for the plant to get nutrition, but that's not always the case. That's going to be something that you're not going to do quite as often or see quite as often as just watering through the soil. So you also have synthetic and natural granule type fertilizers. Synthetic granule fertilizers are going to be like little beads, like a shaken feed that you can put onto your soil, whether it be outside or indoors on your house plants, and it will slowly leach those nutrients over a period of time. These are going to be a much more potent, kind of streamlined way of fertilizing your plants. You want to make sure that you're not over-fertilizing with the granule. Sometimes that can be more difficult. You really want to follow those directions well. You don't want to over-fertilize. That's definitely an upside with the liquid fertilizers, that you can be a little more tedious with how you apply it, and you can be more, it's more of a control whenever you're applying it, how much you're using, so on and so forth. Whereas where like a granule is a little bit more difficult to gauge how much the plant is getting and when it's getting it, and you don't want to over fertilize your plant. So you can also find worm castings as a natural granule that you can use in contrast to your synthetic granules. Whenever you're using worm castings, you can also just top dress the soil with them, meaning that you can just pour some worm castings over top of your soil. You don't really have to mix them in if that's something that you don't want to get into, or you can definitely mix worm castings into the existing soil mix and, you know, kind of pump it up a little bit with some extra nutrients as well. So in addition, there's also different natural fertilizers that you can use. Compost would be one of those. So I have a compost bin out back in a compost pile where I put various things like coffee grounds, eggshells, vegetable scraps, food scraps, all that good stuff. So I let all of that stuff break down in compost, and then you can actually use that in your houseplants, in your soil, to add more nutrients. In the kind of slow release family, you also have things like feeding rods and stakes that you can actually put down into the soil, and those will leach nutrients over a period of time. These aren't always the best option. If you're looking for something very low maintenance, this is a good option. However, it's not going to evenly distribute the nutrients among the soil, so it's not going to be quite as efficient as, you know, putting a fertilizer into a water or using a liquid fertilizer and pouring it directly over the soil and allowing those nutrients to penetrate all of the soil. Whereas if you just stake something into some soil, it's going to just be leaching out nutrients in that general vicinity. So now that we've kind of discussed all of our different types of fertilizers, let's talk about when you should fertilize your plants. Almost always, regardless of what source you look at, you're going to notice that it is very seldom recommended that you ever fertilize a plant outside of its growing season. Whenever it's wintertime and your plants aren't using the nutrients to push out new growth and they're just kind of in their dormant periods, it's not going to be necessary to feed them. An exception to this would definitely be if your plants grow through the fall and the winter because you're in a more tropical climate. If you're like in Puerto Rico or Costa Rica or somewhere closer to the equator, then you can definitely fertilize throughout the season because your plants are going to be requiring those nutrients. So if you're living like the majority of us in a climate where your plants are going to be dormant for a period of time throughout the winter months, it's important that you fertilize whenever you first start to enter springtime until shortly before the fall time. So for me, that's going to be, I'm in zone 6B, so I started fertilizing here in like mid to late April whenever I started to see some new growth on my plants, and then I'm going to stop feeding probably around like the September-October time whenever my plants start to go into more of a dormant period. If you're using a liquid synthetic fertilizer, then you're definitely have a few options. You can follow the directions on the box and only fertilize a few times, maybe once a month throughout the growing seasons. However, what I do is I prefer to do a small amount of feeding almost every time I water. And I usually water plants about once a week, depending on the plant. My succulents go longer, maybe every 2 weeks or so. So I use an all-purpose fertilizer on the majority of my plants throughout the growing season, diluted to 1/4 of a strength with my all-purpose fertilizer. So you can definitely opt to go for more of a diluted version and just do kind of a slow, constant feed throughout the growing seasons, or you can choose to do more of a large amount of nutrients in shorter bursts. Or you can definitely use your stakes towards the beginning of the spring and then take them out towards the fall seasons and allow those nutrients to leach throughout the seasons. If you're using your granules, I would definitely apply them earlier in the spring and allow all of those nutrients to leach out of the granules until you enter those fall months, and then you should be good to go. Now, just a word of caution here. Too much of a good thing cannot be good anymore. And that is definitely true with fertilizer. So, large amounts of nutrients can actually tend to stick onto the root system and collect on the tips of leaves. So sometimes whenever you observe browning leaves on tips, it can mean a variety of different things. One of those things is actually an overabundance of certain nutrients. Particularly with like a plant like a Dracaena, which I mentioned in my care video, over-fertilizing those can be really detrimental to the leaf tips, and they are definitely a plant that will let you know if you're over-fertilizing it or giving it too many nutrients. Another sign of over-fertilization could be root burn, and that's whenever the nutrients stick to the soil and actually do damage to the roots and don't allow nutrients to properly absorb to the roots anymore because they've kind of reached their capacity. They're pretty much saturated with nutrients at that point and they can't handle any more. In addition, it's normal over a period of time to notice various kind of mineral buildup around your pots, specifically with like a terracotta pot, around the drainage hole at the bottom, with any pot really, but terracotta is a little more obvious. You can definitely see like salt deposits and things like that building up on your pots. If you're noticing that happening especially quickly, it could be a sign that you're over-fertilizing or that there's an abundance of nutrients in the soil and you need to leach your soil. So in order to leach your plant and leach the soil, I would run your plant underneath some water under the faucet or underneath your distilled water and just allow water to run through there for like a good 30 seconds. Just let it pour through the pot. And that will allow all of the excess nutrients that are built up into that soil to run out freely. So that way you can get rid of all of those excess nutrients. And that's a good practice as well, to get rid of any salt deposits that you may have in your soil that can actually harm your plants. I would recommend doing that, maybe once a year, once every several months or so. That's a good practice to get into as well. Alright everyone, so just to recap here, you have nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium NPK ratio that you need to be mindful for with different plants. Various plants that flower more are going to prefer more potassium. Different plants that are going to have more foliage will prefer a heavier nitrogen content. So be mindful of that and do your research on your different plants before you choose to fertilize, or just use a general all-purpose fertilizer. Make sure you're fertilizing a little bit on the lighter side because you want to avoid over-fertilization as well. There are many different types of fertilizer in many different forms, many different ways of administering fertilizer. I've also seen people just put eggshells directly into their soil and allow those eggshells to break down and give the plant some extra nutrients as well. There's a lot of different ways. There's different no-waste fertilization methods, composting, synthetic, natural, several different forms as well, so keep that in mind. So, thank you all so much for watching. I know that this is kind of a lengthy video and there's a lot of ground to cover in this video. We definitely touched on a lot of different things. And let me know if you guys have any questions. I know it can be a little bit confusing, and I hope that I shed some light on fertilization, how you should do it, why you should do it, so on and so forth. So I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.